But the aha moment for what I was missing, that came 3 years later. So I was doing the work. There were some improvements in my life. Things were significantly better, but they weren't quite right yet. And that's why I sort of say that it was 3 years later, because that's the aha moment.
Welcome to the Masterful Man podcast. I'm your host, Sven Masterson, coach, mentor, author, and fellow traveler on the path to mastery. Every man reaches the point where he knows he can't keep living the way he has been. The question is, what comes next? Here, you'll hear from men who've made the shift, men who've gone from stuck to unstuck, unshakable, and unstoppable. If you're ready to start moving forward, you're in the right place. In today's episode, I'm talking with Isaac, a husband and father of 3 from Australia, who found himself living a life that looked good on the outside, but was quietly falling apart on the inside. Though he had everything he thought he wanted, steady work, a family, a roof over his head, something just felt off. He was irritable, disconnected, and stuck in a cycle of blame, performance, and deep inner shame. When things got bad enough, he started to believe his family might just be better off without him. But Isaac's story doesn't end there. Instead of checking out, he leaned in. He took a long, hard look in the mirror, started asking deeper questions, and eventually found something most men never discover: a way to hold himself in unconditional high regard. Today, he's not only a different man, he's the kind of man who leads his life, marriage, and family with calm clarity and quiet strength. This conversation is raw, honest, and filled with the kind of insight that can only come from walking through the fire and coming out transformed. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Masterful Man podcast, Isaac. Nice to have you.
Thank you.
We think you may be our first international guest, meaning by no means our first international member of the Masterful community, but I believe you may be our first guest who's from another nation. Other than Canada, in fairness, we have had some Canadians. So I was thinking earlier today, before this recording, I was trying to recall how long I've known you. And it feels like maybe 3 years. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think it is 3 years. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's the first contact.
And one reason I get a little confused about that timing and even your location, I mean, I know you live in Australia now. I think you lived in New Zealand when we first met. So
Yeah, that's correct.
And okay, are you from New Zealand or from Australia? Remind me.
I'm from New Zealand. So I was born and raised there.
Okay. So you're a Kiwi, but an Aussie.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about your journey and specifically how communities played a part of that. So remind me to talk a little bit about why somebody on the other side of the world would be involved in our men's community. But why don't we start by telling our audience a little bit about you, where you come from, what you do, your approximate age group, your marital status, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So originally I come from New Zealand. I now live in Australia. I'm currently living in the top end of Australia in a remote town. I work in there momentarily. My wife is from Australia. I met her here. I am in the age group of 35 to 40. I have 3 children, the oldest of which is 12. I've got a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. I've been married for 13 years now. And I think it's probably really all of it.
Okay. Yeah. So that's helpful. So you're like a lot of men that we talk to on this podcast, but also in our community. You have, a father, married. You're not a newlywed, right? But in your second decade, it sounds like hardworking man. I know you to be. So if we had met you, I met you 3 years ago. Tell me about maybe 4 years ago, what your life was like, how things were going, How would you have described yourself if we met?
Yeah. So I
Kind of
was
thing.
living in New Zealand at the time. Um, so I lived in Australia for 7 years when I first got married with my wife, and then we moved to New Zealand. We were there for all up about 5 years, a little over 5 years. And during that time, that was sort of the point in my life when I realized that I needed to do something. Something wasn't quite right, and that's when everything came to a head.
Okay. What were some of the things like symptom wise for yourself? Like what was going on that was causing you to feel like something wasn't right? Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, it's kind of like I got to a point where, I always dreamed of having a son, and my first son was born. I was working a well-paid job, yet I still wasn't feeling right. My wife sat me down one day and says, "What's going on? Because you've got all the things you really wanted. You're living close to your family. You've got a son who was less than a year old at the time. You're in a job you enjoy and you love doing, and yet you're always grumpy and you're always upset." And it was a good wake up call for me to really focus on, what's my attitude to this? Where's my thinking that I'm considering that this is not what I wanted when it was what I wanted? I'm not
Okay.
dissatisfied with my situation despite it being what I wanted.
Okay. So your wife described you as grumpy. Sounds like your emotional experience was unfavorable. What are some other ways you would describe your emotional life day to day? Like, how is this showing up in the day of the life of Isaac in 4 years ago?
Yeah, I would say that I would have been very transactional in my relationships. I had a focus on trying to gain acceptance and worth from how other people thought of me. And that sort of really showed up in my marriage relationship. It showed up in pretty much all of my relationships is was a relationship of more of take rather than one of giving.
Okay. So I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but I'm wondering if this would be a good way to describe it. Here in the U.S., we might say describe a man like this as just kind of being pissy, just just unpleasant to be around unless things were going a particular way for you. Does that feel like a fair
Yeah,
assessment?
that,
Okay.
that's pretty accurate it's explanation of what my wife was saying about my behavior, my attitudes at home. I would put on a good face when I'm in front of other people. But yeah, at home, that's a fairly good description of how I
Yeah.
was at
Right.
and how I was behaving and showing up at the time.
Grumpy, unpleasant, mopey, pissy. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
All right. Well, I know this is a hard question to ask because today you have insights about those days. If I had asked you 4 years ago, hey man, what's going on? What would you have described as your understanding of why you felt this way
yeah.
back then?
Back then, I think my first go-to explanation would have been, my wife needs to change. If she's not doing this, she's not doing that.
The
She
she's
needs
not
to,
virus? Yeah.
yeah. Now I'm doing all these things. I'm working hard. I'm, you know, paying all the bills because she was a stay-at-home mum and she had her own struggles. But it's like she's not cleaning the house when for ready for me when I come home. She's not cooking meals when ready for me when I'm coming home. She's not cleaning up. She's not tidying. She's anything that I perceived she had to do, and she
Okay.
wasn't, was a nail in the coffin to say, see, look, she has to change.
So let's unpack this a little bit. It sounds like when you got married, you had an idea of what a wife and mother and partner ought to look like or should look like, right?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then you get married, and after the honeymoon wears off, and you start to develop these little annoyances that you just mentioned, right?
Yeah.
Question for you: do you think your wife had any such annoyances about you?
100%. Uh,
What would some of them have been? I know that's a little bit hard to talk about sometimes.
yeah, I think I would say probably her biggest one was me not being true to my word. So I would say what I think she wanted me to say. And then the next person whose acceptance I wanted, I would say to them what I think they wanted to say. Um, and this interaction played out probably most distinctly or obviously between my wife and my dad. I
Mm.
would say to my dad what I think he wanted to hear, and I would say to my wife what I think she wanted to hear. And when those two things were in conflict to each other, neither of them would get the truth. They'd get something in between.
Yeah. Now, I mean, do you think you just had like a crappy character, or I mean, were you doing that because you were an immoral, dishonest person, or what was going on there? You think? Why were you doing this?
Yeah, I know I do look back at that with a new lens now than what I had at the time. So, like I can look back and say, okay, I recognize that this is what I was doing through that. But at the time, I felt I wasn't doing it out of malice. I think it was largely just out of a lack of education, a lack of understanding of knowing what was going on. And it was, it was out of a habit, I think. It's probably the best way to describe it, of not knowing where to get my value from.
Mm.
So because I was in a position in the habit of getting or trying to get my value from other people's acceptance and validation, then I would do that in every situation possible, is try and focus on receiving validation from the other person so I could feel good about myself.
Mm. So then you feel like you have to tell them what you think they want to hear, so that you keep that validation gravy train flowing.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, yeah. A lot of times people describe this as feeling like they're a chameleon. That word comes up a lot, or shape shifting, where you're or people pleasing. I think is another way to say that, where you're just doing what you think is going to make the person happy, because there's an underlying fear there that if I stop making them happy, they'll stop thinking good things about me.
Yeah.
That's what I hear you saying.
Yeah, I've looked at it as I would put a different mask on depending on whose company I was in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that I was essentially showing up for this particular person and what I would have thought that they would like.
Yeah.
And yeah,
What were some of the common masks? Or even another thing I'd love to know is, was there any mask that you put on routinely that you knew you're putting on and you just hated it? You just hated wearing that mask.
no, I'll be honest, I enjoyed a lot of the time. The hardest one is probably in my marriage, it's you can't swap masks very easily. Because you're living with someone who sees you day in and day out. Um, but being an extrovert and outgoing, whenever I'm in a group of people, I loved it. I'd get right into it and have a great time. Um, but then I wouldn't be the same person in a group that I would be at home, and I would enjoy being in both moments, but be a completely different person, and show up in a different way. So I don't
Did you
recall ever being like getting the ick from doing it.
okay? Did you even know you were doing it?
No, not at the time. No, I didn't see it at the time, and it took quite a few years for me to actually get to a point where I can look back at that and go, okay, yeah, now I understand why that's happened.
Okay, I got you. So you're living, sounds like low 30s, couple kids, kind of just disgruntled with life, not necessarily enjoying your marriage, putting on a lot of masks and whatnot. In my experience, that's oftentimes not enough to make a man actually think about his changing his life in a significant way. And for most men, as you know from being in our community, it has to kind of rise to some level of a crisis where the pain of staying that way starts to just become to be too much. So I'm wondering
Oh,
if you could tell us that, like, where did this start to really break for you? Where did this start to become real kind of crisis moment for you?
I'd say there's two sort of moments in my life when I had crisis moments. The first one is, I would say, is significant because it was off the back of that one that sort of really pushed me the second time round when I started going into the same sort of a mentality and mindsets and behaviours. I was still living in Australia at the time, and I had one child. My wife was struggling with chronic fatigue through that sort of a time period. I distinctly remember having a lot of arguments with my wife, and I can see now that they were covert contracts. Um,
Can you define
being
that for the person listening who may not be familiar with that term?
Yeah, sure. So I was showing up in my marriage, doing a whole lot of stuff, making sure that I was for a while self-employed, so running my own business, working hard, and I ex because I was bringing certain stuff to the marriage, I was expecting my wife to bring certain things to the marriage, but I wasn't talking to her about it. We weren't on the same page about it. And when she didn't give me what I thought I wanted, what I needed, what I thought I needed, I would get pissy or pout or give her the silent treatment or mope.
Mm-hmm.
I would just try and manipulate her because she's breached this contract that I had in my head that she was
Yeah.
unaware of because I wanted her to change to give me something that I, you know, didn't have.
Yeah, a lot of times we do this just for the person listening who may not be aware of any of this. That term, many of us found that term in a book called No More Mr. Nice Guy by Dr. Robert Glover. And he talks about covert contracts being really the things that you do that are nice. They appear generous and giving, but there's strings attached. And the strings attached is an expectation that because you did this thing, there's going to be some reciprocity of some kind, right? So common
Yeah,
when in men in your spot, like in this kind of story, is men doing more like domestic work or household work, maybe so that she has more time, and they want her to use that time on them, paying attention to them. Oftentimes, it's not uncommon for men to have this kind of vibe going where they're doing nice things, so she's sexually available. To be blunt, um, men men try to basically earn credit. Hey, if I do this, then when I need this, she's going to be more, apt to want to say yes or to be cooperative with time. For a lot of guys, it's not getting a hassle when they want to go do something that's important to them. This kind of thing. Ring a bell?
oh yeah, definitely. That's exactly what was going on. Is I'd have a scorebook in my head going, I've
Mm-hmm.
done this for you, I've done that for you, and now you have to give me this or that, or um, like whatever it may be. It's I want to go and do something by myself, so she ends up being home with the child struggling, and I don't want to
Yeah,
be about how tough it is while you're gone. So I'll do all these other things, going above and beyond to try and you know appease her so that she's feeling comfortable.
yeah,
Um, yeah,
yeah.
it was
So
a lot of work.
yeah, you know, I wonder if we could kind of, sort of unpack this area a little bit because a lot of people that may listen to a podcast like this will say, "So what's wrong with that? Isn't that normal? Isn't that how relationships are supposed to go?" And I'm wondering what you would say to a man, without erecting too much of a soapbox here, since we've got a lot of conversation to have yet. But what would you say to that man who says, "Well, so what? Isn't that isn't that important?"
Yeah, I
How would you
think
respond?
for me, I think it depends on what's your motivation. At the time, my motivation was I did it because I wanted to get what I wanted. It was a conditional kind of way of living. If I gave you a clean kitchen, then that meant that I would get, um, to go out to this evening event that I wanted to
Yeah,
go out to.
yeah,
If I gave you a clean house, then that would mean that we would get some sort of an intimacy that weekend. You know,
yeah.
it
And
was
so
always giving to
it's what?
get.
Oh, yeah. Sorry to interrupt you there.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of lag with the distance. One important thing that we should mention here is the nature of the covert part of the contract, because there is a healthy place and way to cooperate, of course, in a relationship, which is, hey, I would like to do this week. You would like to do that. How can we work together so that each of us have an opportunity to do something important to us. But see, that's clear. That's not hiding the conditions that you're after. That's not keeping it under wraps. But in covert contracts, you have all of this negotiation and whatnot inside of you, but you don't tell your partner that you're cleaning the kitchen so that they'll say yes to something. In fact, you try to hide that fact. And what's really kind of weird here is a lot of people that do this are people that consider themselves to have high integrity and honesty, but they're not. They're not trustable. They're dishonest. And this is one of the challenges, is that a man doing this generally doesn't see just how dishonest he is and why he's not trustable and why he's not authentic. And it can be a really, really rude awakening to come to that conclusion.
Yeah, I think that's probably very accurate for what I was doing at the time. Now, I would know about an event I wanted to go to on like Saturday or Sunday, and let's say it's Friday night. I would spend the better part of the first half of the week thinking about what I would need to do around the house, and then on Thursday and for Thursday evening and Friday afternoon after I got home from work, I would be going around and tidying up and making sure everything's looking nice and spick.
Yeah.
Finish and then say to my wife, "Hey, I'm going out to this event in half an hour." And so she's getting the first time she's hearing about it is within a few hours before me leaving.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in those moments, I never really considered that she might have other hopes and desires, or she may have wanted to come along, not given her the opportunity to do that. So
Yeah.
that would be the covert side of it is that I'm thinking about all these things inside my own head. I'm not sharing them with anyone.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
What are you trying
doing,
to avoid there too? Because there's another aspect to this we haven't brought up that is almost always there. Why are you doing all this calculating?
yeah.
Like, what's the reason?
I would say that the reason would have been because I I didn't want to discuss it with her in case she said no,
Uh huh.
in case she didn't want me to go, or she was like, no, you have to do X, Y, Z, or it's not going to work out, or anything like that, or yeah,
Is there
just
is there a term that you would use to describe everything that you're describing?
probably I can't think of it right now, but I was trying to avoid the conflict.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. You're describing conflict avoidance. And what is conflict avoidance really fueled by?
It was for me at the time. It was fueled by a desire for my wife to see me a certain way. So I didn't want my wife to be upset with me because then that meant that I wasn't a good enough person.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
if my wife wasn't being loving and kind, then that meant that I wasn't loving and kind.
Yeah.
Or that meant that I wasn't worthy, um,
That's it.
loved.
That's it.
That would have been the foundation for all of this. Is looking back, is that I didn't feel like I was worthy of anything, and so I had to earn it.
Does it feel fair to just call that fear? The
Yeah,
fear that,
definitely.
yeah. And the reason I'm drawing this out is I want to help our listener connect the dots that, a lot of times we just read a book or hear people talk about it's a low quality man that, that does XYZ, to use your Aussie way of saying that. But in reality, the root here is fear. A man is, and actually, I think we could go a little bit deeper and even say it's shame. But when you're afraid, then you seek to avoid conflict. And when you are conflict avoidant, one of the tools conflict avoidant men use to try to get their needs met is covert contracts or manipulation, control, this kind of stuff. Ironically, did it produce the result you were looking for?
No, it just made matters worse.
Right.
Uh,
You got more conflict, didn't you?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And because of the fact too that I would get to a point where sometimes it could be a few weeks or sometimes it could be a month or two. But I would get to a point where it's like, oh, this is something I want to do, something like have visitors over or do something like that. And because of all this work that I've been doing over the past, weeks or whatever, and this is thinking in my head, I haven't discussed this with my wife. I would decide that, this is something that we're doing. And she must follow along, despite the fact that she might be feeling sick or hasn't had much sleep the night before because the child has been playing up or something like that.
Right.
But I would just ignore her concerns or any of her comments and plow on ahead with doing something. So
Right.
because I felt like I deserved it.
Yeah. And the irony here is, do you think that endeared your wife to you? Did it give her an occasion to trust you, respect you, appreciate you, value you, to want to connect with you, to want to be intimate with you? Are any of those things, how you understand them now, are they going to compel a woman to feel good towards you?
No, I think it would have done the opposite.
Right. And then you
Yeah,
get pissy about that. That's one of
yeah.
the traps, is men are doing all these things not realizing how off-putting it is to a partner, and then get really torqued at the partner for the partner's disinterest.
Yeah, I think it's also deeper than that too, though, is that when I'm treating someone, I treat my wife in that manner, I don't come across as someone worthy of respect, and yet I'm demanding my wife respect me. And then I'll get pissy because she's not, not surprisingly. And growing up in a Christian household, respect is one of the ones that, or submission particularly, is often was often taught. And so it's like, well, I'm the husband. You have to submit to me, and you're not. You're
Yeah.
being rude or unkind or whatever it is. And so,
So do you feel like that was an element? Meaning, did your background with faith sort of set you up in a way that, did you feel like that contributed towards these things? I mean, it's really common for people from this background to misapply, I would say, some scriptures about submission and respect. And, people like to whip out with the Second Corinthians about wives not to denying your husbands, more or less, this kind of thing.
yeah,
Yeah. So you learned some of those things.
oh, definitely. Yeah, and I think for myself, the misapplication of that was I would use that as a weapon rather than as a mirror. I
Mm.
wasn't looking at it from the perspective of how does this affect my life? I was looking at it from the perspective of how can I use this to get my wife to do what I want her to do?
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely played a part, and yeah, misunderstanding the actual applications of that contributed to me having that sort of a thinking at that time.
It does not sound like a thriving relationship. Before we continue, I want to pause here for just a moment. What you're about to hear includes discussion of suicidal thoughts and despair. If you're in a dark place right now, if you're feeling hopeless, overwhelmed, or like you might be better off gone, I want you to know this: you're not alone, and there's help. Please reach out, talk to someone. Your life matters, and you're not beyond healing or connection. If you're in the U.S., call or text 988 anytime. That's 988 anytime. For international help, visit findahelpline.com. That's findahelpline.com to find support wherever you are. You're not weak for feeling this way. You're human, and you are worth walking through this pain with someone by your side. Now let's continue our conversation.
No, no, and that's one of the things too. Like that sort of time period, it would have been about 8 years ago now. But that time period was it got so bad that for myself, I looked at because I had a value sense of what do other people see me, how do other people see me, and if they see me as valuable or worthy, then that means that I am. And like really just focusing on my own sense of utility. So I'm only worth something if I have utility. And because I am in my own way trying to show up in my marriage as best as I knew how, and my wife is still dissatisfied, I had very strong thinking about taking my own life at
Mm-hmm.
that time. And it was a real
Yeah.
struggle for me, and it got pretty bad. And coming out of that is I managed to come out of that through support of others, and other people came in and helped me out through that. And having a close bond with other men was vital for me at that point in my life.
Yeah, you're really
Um,
fortunate.
yeah,
Yeah, that is a big problem with a sense of self worth that is defined outside of you, which I know is an oxymoron to define self worth from other people, but we do. That the real big problem is that if you can't if you can't see yourself as having utility, if you don't perform well, you lose your sense of worth. And a lot of people, when they feel worthless, they lose the reason for living, and it becomes the basis for, I think, what does drive a lot of people to end their life. It's
yeah, and
really sad.
it is. And I was altruistic in my thinking at the time, going, like, I want what's best for my family, and all of the problems that my family are facing are centered around me. So therefore, if I take myself out of the equation, then they'll be better off, which is not certainly not the right way of thinking about it. And like I think, yeah, coming out of that and having support of other people was the start of really the start of my journey towards recognizing those sorts of things and
Okay.
and starting to really sort of move from that towards ownership and acceptance.
Yeah, I want to unpack that for sure. I'm wondering if you could, as we head towards kind of talking about changes you experienced,
Mm.
I wonder if we could talk about what did you try? What are some other things you tried to rectify this internal state you didn't like, to make your marriage better, to make your relationship better? What are some things that you tried, specifically things that you didn't find very effective? Because I think it's really helpful for men to be honest about, like, hey, I tried that, didn't work for me, so that we can kind of learn from one another this way.
Yeah. Um, I think probably the one thing that at that time, I would have tried that didn't work for me would have been, sort of laying down the law in the sense of, I think I look back and I really pushed my wife in the months after that to saying essentially, you know, I was encouraged to create boundaries, but the boundaries that I created in my life were more rules than they were boundaries.
How would you define the difference for somebody listening?
Yeah,
Like, how
so and
how would you know?
yeah, there's a subtle difference, but and it is hard. But the difference is the boundary is something I will or will not do, whereas a rule is something of saying you must do or you must not do. Um, so a boundary is something that I apply to myself, and a rule is something that I apply to someone else.
Yeah,
And
one
so,
of the that's one of my favorite ways to have that conversation, is to a way to fact check your boundaries, is your boundaries cannot require anything of any other person. If there's
yeah,
any subject in your boundary that is not you, it's a wish or a rule, but it's not a boundary,
yeah,
because it requires other people do something that may not work for them and their sovereignty.
yeah. And that was what I was doing is I was creating a set of rules or wishes, if you put it that way. But I was very harsh in how I did it too, which was very, I think, very challenging for my wife at the time. And I think, yeah, in that sense, it's because, looking back, I can see now that I was trying to do something too soon in the piece of my learning. Like you have to take a step back from there and go further back and actually have a more of a foundation for your thinking before you can get to that point.
Good point. Yep. So, anything else that you tried that you, looking back, you would caution somebody about who was struggling in their marriage and wondering why these covert contracts and rules or quoting scriptures aren't working for them?
I really don't recall many of them off the top of my head because I dwell on the things that worked,
Okay, we'll get to those.
you
Yeah.
know. Yeah, and so like perhaps I would have to see a situation. I've tried that. I know that that doesn't work.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, I
I'll
would
give you a
say,
common one, it probably sounds like I pick on this a lot, but a really common one is love languages, where people say, I learned her love language. I'm speaking this love language, but it's not working. She said she likes gifts of service, and I do all this serving. So it's a favorite approach by people, by the way, who have covert contracts, is to use love languages as the the language of those covert contracts. I'm speaking gifts of service, but she's not speaking physical affection back, right? So
Yeah.
that's a common one.
Yeah, and I think that once again that comes down to your motivation. Like I don't disregard love languages that they are helpful, but
Yeah,
when you're using them to keep score or to weaponize,
right.
then
Yeah.
they're very unhelpful. And when all you're really doing is contributing to the problem, you're just choosing a different flavor.
Mm,
And
yep.
so I think in that sense, it's yeah, going to getting to the point if you're still maintaining these an internal dialogue or an internal score of I've spent quality time with my wife, and that means that I should be getting something back from her. If you've got a mentality of I'm giving to get, then no matter what it looks like in your life, it's not going to work.
Right. Yep. You just build up that big ledger of things owed to you, and that ledger becomes the basis for disappointment and then resentment.
Yeah.
Okay. So all of this is driving you to the place where you mentioned you're seriously thinking that maybe you're better off not being alive, that your family's better off not without you being alive. Did you ever tell your wife that? Did she know you struggled with this?
Yeah, she was there during the moment that it got to a peak.
Yeah.
Um, and so it was more than just thinking in my experience, for what I went through, it was more than just me thinking about it. I got to the point of taking action, and that was at the point that I received intervention as well. Um, someone outside of my marriage, and that's what sort of pushed me essentially on the path to maturity and growth. Uh,
Well, I wonder if we could talk about this very uncomfortable subject for a few minutes, because there's a whole other angle to this when a man is that serious about his life ending, that I don't know that most men understand some impact it has on their partners. Would you be okay if we talk about that?
Yep.
So, and I'm sharing this as a man who I never took my own self-loathing to the level that you did, but I did take it to the level of just telling my wife like I didn't want to live anymore, and that I just thought I would be better off dead. And what I didn't realize that did to her is it put her in a really hard spot, because now she could see that I was despairing of life. And with where she was in life, it put her in a spot where she thought to herself, okay, now I'm really stuck, because I don't have a way to solve his problem without becoming inauthentic and doing all these things that I hate. I feel like I have to accept his manipulation. I have to accept his covert contracts. I have to start showing up in a way that is so different than he is inviting me with his actions. You see what I'm getting at? So
Yeah.
she felt like it just put her in this impossible space where she now has to rescue me, not just from my bad moods, from all these other, like, pissy, melancholy ways, but now from despairing of my very life. I'm
It
wondering
puts an
if,
extra pressure on them too because
yeah, that's what I
it's
meant. Yeah.
you
It's a
know
lot of
in the
pressure.
sense that oh yeah, definitely because if I think for my wife it would have been if I say no to this, what's that going to do to him? How's
That's
he
it.
going to
Yeah, that's
react?
it. Yeah,
You know?
you just articulated it much better than I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, they feel like they have to. It's a tremendous amount of pressure. I have to show up and comply now, because if I don't, I might experience a loss of my partner. My children may see their father perish. I mean, that's just a massive amount of pressure for a partner. Now, I'm not saying that because of this, men should keep their mouth shut. That's what I'm not saying, but just that when we're struggling this way because of these things, it, it's tremendously complicated for the relationship.
Definitely. Yeah.
You're really fortunate that somebody, an outsider, stepped into this with you. Can you tell us a little bit about that story? with whatever
Yeah,
feels
so
appropriate to say.
yeah, um, the person that stepped in and helped me out had already gone through his own life journey and come out sort of done coaching and that sort of stuff. So a lot of the advice he gave me was life changing. And I'd say really the anthem, one of the things that I was focusing on at the time that he told me was, if you can look at yourself in the mirror and would you be a friend with yourself? And if not, then you're the one who can change that. What part about yourself would you not want to be a friend with? And just bringing back the focus to the point where the only person you can control is yourself. And that, I think, really builds on what we've been discussing already, because covert contracts and all these sort of I give to get kind of a thing, underlying all of that is my desire to control my wife in such a way to get what I wanted. It was a manipulation. So I would try and manipulate my wife in whatever way I could in order to get what I wanted. You know, that manipulation might be pouting or refusing to talk to her when I know she wants to talk, or it might be yelling and screaming and using my physical presence to intimidate her, um, depending on whichever one I thought would work. If none of them all worked, then what do I do? And so moving away from that and focusing on the only person you can control is yourself, that helped me in that a lot during that time period.
So when you looked in that mirror, did you feel like you would be friends with yourself?
Not at the time, no, definitely not.
What would you have said
Um,
was your reason why?
'Cause you never knew who you're going to get. I think, you know, because I live in my own body, of course, I can look at myself in the mirror at the time and go, you know, who am I? How am I going to show up in any given moment? It's not going to be consistent because, um, you know, if I was with person A, I would show up in a flamboyant way, let's say, and then I go and visit person B who's much more subdued. And then I would change my language. I would change the way I would speak to them. I would change my posture, how I would stand, and everything like that in order to show up to this person in the way that I thought they would like me. And, you know, in that sense, it's all an attempt to try and control them or influence them into liking me or giving me validation or worthiness.
Was there a moment other than the intervention of this friend that you would consider just a real aha moment and a turnaround moment in your story?
At this point in my story, I think it wouldn't have been that wouldn't have been the aha moment. It was much later on when I think it was probably 3, 4 years later
Oh wow.
when, yeah, so,
So what happened real before you get to that? What happened in those 3 or 4 years between your friend intervening and you discovering, hey, I don't think I'd be my own friend? Can you kind of cover that space a little bit for us?
so I would say in that 3 years, I was focusing on trying to be my own friend. But the aha moment for what I was missing, that came 3 years later. So I was doing the work. There were some improvements in my life. You know, things were significantly better, but they weren't quite right yet. And that's why I sort of say that it was 3 years later, because that's the aha moment. Yeah, it's
Can you
all a
tell
bit
us
of a
about that?
blur. Yeah, yeah. I got to the point where I was much more happy, much more content, but yet still there's something missing. And during this time period, I'd moved countries, and my friend was still living in Australia. I'd moved back to New Zealand. And life was hard, and so when life was hard, you know, a lot of these things that I was doing were struggling with. And I sort of started to notice that the feeling inside of me that I was getting was very similar to the how I was approaching my life in the sense when I was struggling previously. And so I was like, I need to do something different here. This is not working. And I recall a conversation I had on the phone with my friend, and he said to me two things that were very helpful. And the first one was your wife saw something in you when you first got married that it was different than anyone else. She connected with you because, why did she connect with you? What was it that she saw in you? Is it because, you were living your life in a sense of not trying to gain her approval? And how did you lose that? And then the second thing you said in that conversation was you have in your mind the tools and the knowledge of knowing how to get over this, get through this struggle that you're going through. Do you need professional help in order to have a lasting impact on your life? Because there's a difference, I think, between knowing and doing. And through those 3 years, we'd had a lot of conversations about how things live in life differently and that sort of stuff. And there was a disconnect between knowing it and doing it. And that was the push that I needed in order to actually go, well, maybe I do need professional help. Maybe I do need more support in order to do this sort of stuff. And that's when I did a Google search, and then I honestly cannot tell you what I Google searched. But the first thing that came up was Steve Horsman's website, Good Guys to Great Men. And, I was on the train going to work, which took about an hour at the time. I spent the entire time reading through the landing page on his website, and I was just as I got to the end of my train ride, I got to the bottom of his landing page, and it says, well, "You've made it this far. How about committing to signing up to a newsletter?" And it was free, and so I did that. And it was about a week later that you sent out a series of emails on your experience that gave me the aha moment, because your experience was almost identical to mine in the sense, and then a lot of the things you're saying, in the sense that I would go into bed at night time wishing that my wife would die in her sleep, so that I could get a better one.
Yeah, it's such like it's so hard to admit that, isn't it? I
It's
mean,
definitely.
I've come to terms with it now, and I can still remember mentioning that the very first time in front of Zelda. I felt so vulnerable to say that, but I thought she would want to like punch me in the face hearing me say that. But, in all honesty, I think she probably felt the same way about me. And I think that's why she has not been, she's been pretty gracious in hearing me say that, because I think there's a part of her that says like, yeah, I felt that way a few times. So, I don't think I knew this about you. I don't. So I feel tremendously validated right now, or not validated. It's the wrong word. I feel less alone in my embarrassment about that time in my life. Just hearing you
Well,
say that.
yeah, and I distinctly remember that you sent the second email you sent out, the second series of six, I think it was, 5 or 6 that you sent out. The second one, I read it 3 times because there was a line in there that you were talking about shame, that you felt that this was all as a result of, you know, shame in a sense that you were. I sort of get the gist of it. I don't remember it word for word, but all of the things that you were doing was grounded not in a desire to be the best person, but grounded in a covering up the shame that you had and that you're
Mm-hmm.
experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was the aha moment for me. It's kind of that is it right there. Um, and that was the turning point in my life. I can still remember where I was standing when I read that,
Wow.
and that was just the missing piece in my life was that because I hadn't been able to deal with the shame that sort of led me towards reaching out to someone, trying to get some form of coaching or something like that,
Mm.
so that I could, essentially become where I am today.
What's interesting about that, Isaac, is that I remember deliberating over how much to talk about shame in that email series, because most people are not going to want to connect the dots that deeply in emails to go to free newsletters. And I remember talking to lots of people about it, and people were being like, "Yeah, I'm not sure people are really going to be able to connect this to shame." And it's been difficult in my practice and what I write about to keep writing about shame because most people, it's really rare that somebody would be willing to understand or even consider that they have a shame problem. And it's also complicated by people thinking I'm saying the emotion of shame, which might be there. But when I'm talking about shame in that newsletter back then and anytime, I'm really just talking about the belief that you're not a good thing, that the belief
Yeah,
that there's something innately wrong with you. And I do know that that's like that's the taproot for a lot of this stuff, right? But it felt really vulnerable. But I've asked myself a number of times, like, should I be writing about that? Just is it worth it? Is anybody going to get it? And so I didn't know this about your story. I mean, I probably did, but maybe I forgot. But I didn't. I don't think too many people have told me, yeah, shame, like that really jumped out to me. So that feels good too, because I've wondered a lot of times, should I talk about shame in these newsletters or writing or books? Because most people say, like, that's not my problem. I just have a bad wife, right? Um,
yeah,
and they don't. It's not easy for everybody to connect those dots. That's my point.
yeah. I think for me it was because the way that you described your experience and you growing up and that sort of a stuff. And I think growing up in with a religious background, I think that sort of the culture that's involved in that is one of the things that contributes to it in the sense that for myself it was when someone gave me a compliment and I said, "Oh, thank you for that. I appreciate the compliment." Their response was, "No, no, don't get a big head."
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, I think understanding it for myself and the way that you wrote it being it was rooted in shame, it was the it gave me a perspective to see it of going, okay, well now I know what I have to work on. And I think that was yeah, for myself, I see that that was definitely the pivotal point in my journey is understanding that aspect of it because not necessarily being shame as an embarrassed, but shame as in a belief,
Of
being
your value and
ashamed.
worth.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Being
Yeah.
ashamed of myself.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Another way to talk about that would be to just talk about value and worth. And that's why I talk about those a lot. And shame is just the belief that I don't have any value or worth, or that my
mm,
value and worth is very, very shaky. Right. I would say being ashamed is feeling an emotion rooted in that. Yeah. Shame for our context is the belief that there's something innately wrong with me.
yeah,
And maybe we could talk about the religious component to this. I mean, I think shame is a universal condition, but it is kind of weirdly ironic that oftentimes it's in a religious context where you feel more of this, right? And that was really confusing for me. And if you want to read my story about that, if you're a listener, you could read my book, What to Do When the Aliens Show Up. I go pretty deep into my background with that. But yeah, maybe could you unpack for the guy listening who maybe he's from a religious background and he's curious by what we're talking about. What would you unpack the connection between shame and growing up in a religious background and how, you mentioned a little example of, like not being able to receive a compliment. Could you unpack that a little bit more for us, just how shame was maybe cultivated a little bit for you in a unique way in that background?
yeah. I think in a sense too, like I think it was just the mentality that anything that you do that is good is, in a sense, comes from the power of God, um, and all the bad that comes from you. So don't take credit for the good things you do, only take credit for the bad things you do. And I think in some senses it's true, but in other senses it's not true because um, you're still the person doing the nice thing or the good deed. It's just that the focus being on this is the way I perceived it. Is the
Yeah.
focus being on when I do something bad, that's me, and when something good in my life happens, it's not me. And so
Do you see the implicit separation belief in that? that me and God are separate.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to highlight. Is that was my belief, the way I understood it, and that
Yeah.
was the wrong way to understand it. In that sense, because it didn't help me at all whatsoever. And so it's the misunderstanding of all of that, without going too much into that side of things. But yeah, the misunderstanding of that is a big contributing factor. And I don't know if it's just a cultural thing, whether or not it's a culture of the church or a culture of where I grew up. But the ability to receive a compliment or thanks or kindness graciously was always something that a lot of people I grew up with struggled with. So
I was 43 years old before I could receive a compliment for that exact reason, because to say thank you or to appreciate some compliment was immediately met with a similar remark that you said, which was rooted in this worry that would be fleshly and carnal, or pick your vocabulary word from that context, and that it would produce pride and arrogance. But it was ultimately rooted in this belief that it's a misquotation or misunderstanding, but there's no good thing in you, right?
yeah,
Are you familiar with that?
yeah,
And that's a quotation of the Apostle Paul, who's saying, I know that and actually if you read the text, it says in parentheses, that is in my flesh is no good thing. But it's taught like there's nothing good about you. And if it weren't for, count your lucky stars that you know God, you'd have nothing good to offer the world. So it's this message of you're worthless, you're worthless, you're worthless. And the good news is that despite being worthless, you're going to get to go to heaven when you die. That is how a lot of us learned. Ironically, I don't even like to call it this, but that's what a lot of us were told is the good news. That's the worst good news ever. The absolute worst good news ever. If that's
yeah.
it, yeah.
It misses the point too, because the point being is that you have no good inside of you in order to save yourself. But once you are saved, then you produce good works. And so that's definitely, I think, the way that it should be taught, is that the good works are something that you do through the power of God, not something you witness. But yeah, I definitely think the mentality and the example of making light of any form of compliment it's a contributing factor to my beliefs, essentially, in that sort of sense, the
Yeah,
culture of
yeah.
that.
Well, maybe I'll have you on for another episode where we can dive into kind of some of the minefields about growing up with certain perspectives. And I appreciate that. What I think I hear you kind of trying to do is also say, look, it's not the source. And I would say the same thing. Like, I don't blame, Christianity on the whole or the scriptures, because I believe it ultimately comes down to people teach you these things and they're teaching them to you through their perspective and worldview and their lens. And because hurt people, if a hurting, unhealed person with self-worth, like no self-worth, teaches you Bible things or Quran things, or really any from any text, they're going to teach you through the lens of their hurt. And so I just want to be clear for our listener, like, this is not an anti-faith or religion, or it's not anti-anything message. It's just the way our stories both unfolded. We were taught things and perspectives that did not build our self-worth up, but contributed to the belief that we didn't have it.
Yeah.
And that is otherwise known as shame.
Yeah.
And shame will rear its head in your life, right? So again, we'll talk about maybe another episode. We can dive into the particulars about this, but
Yeah. I think too, though, that when you're in a culture where they say one thing and do something else, that
yeah,
this doesn't help either.
yeah, yeah. I call this in my Aliens book, when I write about my particular journey, which is only a part of that book, but I refer to this as learning about the conditional, unconditional love of God. Just the way I learned it, it was like, it was taught in this kind of weird, non-resolvable way. That's what comes up for me when you say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so shame. So your big aha moment, it sounds like, was really coming to a place where you could consider the possibility that your shame, this, or let's just say shame slash self-worth, was at the root of what was going on for you. So
Yeah.
what happened next?
So from that point onwards, I actually reached out to I reached out to Steve Horsman, and that was great because the next day I get a video from Steve Horsman directly to me, which was that was um, I say that for me the first time that someone had one of the first times, not the first, but one of the first times that someone had reached out to me in that manner, being I did nothing in order for him to take the time out of his day to
Mm-hmm.
send me that video, and that the feeling of being valued, like the sense of value that I received from him through that video was, that was huge, in a sense of, wow, this guy has taken, you know, 5 or 10 minutes out of his day to send me specifically a video because that's what he wanted to do. That was exceptionally rare for me. And it started me on the path towards getting coaching. The thing was, at the time though, my situation is I didn't have the finances to be able to afford it. And so shortly after, I'd say shortly afterwards, but it could have been a year later, I moved back to Australia. And during that process of moving back to Australia, shortly after I moved, there was a group of people who were doing counselling in the church that I was at in Australia. And they had a 5 session course on emotions
Hmm.
that they were running. And I sort of seen the advertisement for this and thought, no, that'll be interesting, And my wife approached me and she, with this flyer, and says, I think you should go to that. And that's pretty big for me because there's very, very few times in my married life prior to this event where there's something that I wanted to go to and my wife was saying to me, I think you should go and I'm going to help you get there. And so I went to that and I met someone there who was a coach, and he ended up giving me some coaching sessions. I do not recall how many coaching sessions I went through with him, but that was the point in my life that I came face to face with the fact and accepted the fact that growing up I was bullied. And that would have been the second pivotal part of
Mm.
my journey, is accepting the fact that I was bullied, and it wasn't my fault. And through that process, recognizing that my thinking was a thinking of self-loathing, rather than self-love. And I prefer to use the term that that you use, being unconditional high regard, because of the connotations of where I grew up, being self-love equals selfishness,
Mm-hmm.
which I disagree with. I think I like the clarity of unconditional high regard, because I did not have unconditional high regard for myself. I had self-loathing, um, and working through that, moving towards acceptance of myself, unconditional high regard for myself, and practicing that. That was the turning point in my life.
Yeah, well, there's so much there. There's a lot of stuff you've talked about that itself could be all episodes. And we do have very similar stories in a lot of ways. And bullying was a big part of mine too. I was bullied from the first grade until the eighth grade, pretty much with no break. What made that hard for me, and maybe you'll relate to this, is when you're bullied, it's basically people telling you that you don't have worth. And I would come home, and what you really need is you need kind of like a counterweight and an antidote to that, where somebody's saying you are worthy, you are valuable. But because of the religious component, or at least in my context, I got the message of the bully reinforced, which is, yeah, you don't have worth. Or here's how to be Christ-like to the bully. And so now the bully, the bully was worthy of actually this unconditional love that I wasn't. So this became impossible for me to rectify. So huge part of my own story as far as it just made the self-loathing that much worse because it was always I had to think about what the bully needs instead of what about the just the insanity of the kind of things portrayed to me. I like, and not, I know this isn't my episode, but just to highlight this a minute. I had one person tie me to a tree, try to light me on fire, like legit try to light me on fire. I had a person throw a football in my face, like at point blank range. And, never anybody like, let's go try to stop this from happening. It's how could you be Christ-like in your love to these people? So, I mean, I
Yeah,
appreciate maybe that people were doing their best, but it put
I
me in
think
an impossible spot of self-loathing.
yeah. For me, it was a lot more subtle, the bullying I received. So, people, the first time I ever heard the term reject was when someone was trying to get my attention by calling me a reject. I didn't know what it meant at the time. Finding out about that was pretty hard. Being always been the last person that gets chosen for a sporting event, having children uh, in the playground after church, trying to get their mates and push them onto us, and then ostracizing them because they've got our disease now. That kind of it's an insidious but subtle, I think, kind of a way of doing it. And um, it, I look at it now, I can see that all of it contributed to my own thinking being I don't have value and worth. And I think because there were some adults, not my parents, but some adults in my life who also contributed to this in subtle ways, reinforce that idea. I think it sort of made it a lot harder. And because none of it was physical bullying, it was all emotional bullying. Um, I really didn't have the ability to articulate it very well to my parents. And so, in that sense, I don't, I don't even know if my parents knew about it to that extent. I mean, it was only recent now that in my own life that I look back at that and go, okay, I can see that as bullying. But in a sense, so that it was, yeah, it was a real challenge going through that. I think it's fair to say that it was not from inside my home life or anything like that. It was anything outside of that
Yep, yep.
that contributed to that.
Well, I wanted to unpack that a little bit because I think it's important to kind of understand the depth of self-loathing in order to really talk about unconditional high regard for yourself. So maybe if you could unpack a little bit about, how this idea of unconditional high regard, or what we call UHR for short, how that started to kind of be the healing balm for self-loathing. Like, what did that look like for you? Can you unpack that experience a little bit?
Yeah, so
The shift in your perspective and understanding. And
for me, it's tied into a lot of I think acceptance is um, also tied into it too. And acceptance in the sense of being an antidote to judgment. So if I'm looking, if I have a view of myself from a perspective of self-loathing, then I am looking at myself through judgment, through a lens of judgment. I am judging my character, my actions, my behaviors, and my conclusion from that judgment is a self-loathing. But if I change my thinking in the sense of looking at myself and going, I am going to accept myself as I am in every single moment, and then from that move towards unconditional high regard. And the way that it looked in my life was, um, you know, looking at any situation where I sort of start moving towards this where I'm struggling is, I have, so I had young children, very young children at the time, and I just imagined myself being a 4 or 5, 6 or 7, somewhere between 4 and 7 year old child, and go, how would I approach a 7 year old child that I love that I want to comfort, how would I approach that? What would I do to my child between the age of 5 and 7 who's struggling with this particular thing, who shared with me this struggle? How would I approach that? And I would then apply that to myself as an adult. So I would comfort myself as if I was that age.
Mm. So is it fair to describe it like this? You were treating yourself with the same regard you believe other people are worthy of too.
Yeah,
Like you're willing to like kind of reimagine you as being just as worthy to receive the same way you'd treat a 4 to 7 year old.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
That's lovely. That's awesome.
yeah. And it was something that I had to practice. It was a practice. It's not a one-off event. It's something that I would do. Things would get better, and then I'd stop doing it, and things would get
Yeah.
worse. And it's
There's a
something.
process to this, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what I'm trying to get across. Is that it was a process, and
Mhm.
because of the fact that this habit was established over years of my younger life, expecting it to be solved inside of a month as an adult is a bit extreme, I think, because it took you years to form this habit, so it'll take a while for you to get out of it. As that was my perspective. So giving myself patience, um, and just yeah, like mentally giving myself a hug and saying to myself, "I love you for who you are right now." That was the tools that I used um, during that process on a regular basis, sometimes daily.
What role did community play in that? Was there even a community element for you in that time?
Not at the time, no. So um, I wasn't in a financial position to be doing anything to be able to do much of that at the time.
Hmm. So you
It
learned about
was,
UHR, but you hadn't joined anything yet.
yeah, I hadn't joined the Masterful Men or the Mentor and Men community at that point yet.
Hmm.
It was shortly after that I joined the community, so within a few months later, kind of a
So
thing.
were you going off of like what you had read about it? Like, I mean, probably a lot of sources, but UHR is kind of a very unique term, right? Like most people,
Yes,
did you
yeah.
get that from that email, that group of emails?
I don't know where I got it from, and I also don't know if UHR is something that I got from the mentoring community, and I applied the language to it now, looking back. But
Yeah.
definitely the practice of that with the coaching I received over, I think it was about a 3 month period. I was receiving coaching from this man I met, and that for me was the catalyst for change.
Hmm.
Is as he helped me through practice. He taught me this practice of looking back, looking at myself, a younger version of myself, being that child and actually going, I love you, I accept you. And that kind of an approach is something that I needed for my journey. And yeah, I think, yeah, so I'm pretty sure you would have said in your email, the series of 6 emails, Unconditional High Regard, because I'm pretty sure I come across it beforehand. And that was already part of my thinking at the time. And it's perhaps a blog post that you put up because I was following your blogs then already. And for me, it's the my background being a Christian background and any love for self is selfish. Using the term unconditional high regard encapsulates more fully what I think unconditional love ought to be.
Yeah. Yeah. I posted an article yesterday, and I think it was yesterday in Masterful Men, written by a psychologist, where they referred to it as unconditional self worth, and I love that way to say it too. Anyway,
Yeah.
terms are not as important as like the understanding that they lead us to, right? And what it helped you do is it gave you a way, the term, the practice, it gave you a way to start thinking differently about yourself. And
Uh-huh.
specifically, what I hear you saying is it gave you a way to release yourself from judgment. And the thing with bullying, I would say, is a lot of times What bullying does to a lot of people, it seems like psychologically, is it becomes a story that even when the bully's not there, you start to you start living in like the psychological repetition of the story, and it programs your view of self. So like you start to self-talk the way the bully talks, and it becomes a way that you program yourself alongside of the bully, that you don't have worth, that you don't have value, and ultimately that you teach people to deeply judge themselves. And the way I would say, like, judgment, when you judge anything, you have a winner and loser. Would you agree?
No, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you judge a person, they either come out as acceptable or condemned. And you call this self-loathing. But when your internal judgment, you keep coming up not acceptable, you come up as condemned. So you teach people to condemn themselves or to reject themselves. And that becomes like an innate view of yourself. You believe, I am condemned, I'm rejected, I didn't pass the judgment, I'm not acceptable. And that's the state of a lot of us, right? And
Mm.
so what I hear you saying and describing is your process unfolded in a way with this coach, from that you got in touch with in Australia at the time, or this is New Zealand,
Yeah.
Australia. The term UHR, all these things were coming together to give you a way to start releasing yourself from condemnation and to start
Yeah.
seeing yourself as acceptable.
That's
Fair?
right. And
Yeah.
definitely fair because, I mentioned early on the concept of would you be friends with yourself?
Yeah.
And I couldn't honestly but answer that question with a mindset of self-loathing because if I have a mindset of self-loathing, then I would never want to be friends with myself,
Mm-hmm.
and I would try and change myself through through judging myself. And all that does is it puts you further down the spiral of unworthiness. And if you're in a spiral of unworthiness, then oftentimes, and this is the case in my life too, is I would find external things in order to either A, try and gain worthiness or try and mask the pain of feeling
Mm.
unworthy. And it can show up in people's lives in different ways, being either through drug and substance abuse. It could also be pornographic material or something along those lines. It could be, in a sense, a constant drive for overachievement.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
overachieving in sports or work or something along those lines. Or
Yep.
it could also come out in the way that you spend money because you spend money to have all these new fancy items so that other people go, oh, look at that guy, he's cool. Um, and so none of these things provide any form of acceptance. They mask the pain of that kind of a thing. And yeah, I would say that anyone who's struggling with those things, it's coming from a place of self-loathing rather than a place of self-acceptance.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Yeah, you're trying to bring yourself up to the standard in which you'll pass the judgment. That's the way I would describe that.
Yeah.
The problem is the goalpost moves all the time, because
Yeah.
let's just say yours is about money. You're like, man, if I could just make $100,000, I'll be acceptable. Then you make $100,000 and you look to your neighbor, and your neighbor makes $500,000, and so now you reset the judgment because you say, well, 500 compared to 100, I'm clearly on the losing side. Now I have to go make $500,000, and that's an oversimplification, but the judgmental mind, just it's unrelenting in these judgments if you're willing to play that game, right? So you do it with acquiring wealth, you do this with acquiring validation from other people. A lot of men do this through the attraction of females, how often you get sexual attention. People do it with academics, they do it with being the smartest person in the room, the smartest guy at work. It just goes on and on and on and on. And I would say that's why so many overachievers come our way, is it ends up taking over your whole life. Your whole life becomes about how to basically win at the value and worth game through an
Yeah,
endless striving.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
In that sense, I think too, like, my experience was more in the numbing side rather than the overachieving side.
Hmm.
And so I had a tend to have a focus on pursuing things in order to mask the pain of judging myself. So in my younger years, I was heavily involved in computer gaming to the point that it was unhealthy for me. And that being part of a community was a big thing for that because you've got a community that you're a part of, an online community that they when you turn up they're kind, considerate, they're asking how you doing and that sort of stuff, and you're working to do something together,
Hmm.
which is encouraging in
Hmm.
that sense. But it was all done for myself. It was done from a position of wanting to cover or mask something that I lacked inside of myself.
Have you seen the it's on Netflix, I think it's called Ibelin, Ibelin. It's really an interesting, it's a documentary about community and acceptance found in a gaming community. It's a really interesting documentary. I would encourage you to watch it.
Yeah,
I don't want to give away the story, and I hear you about the numbing, but it's interesting. A lot of people do, like, that's where they find their community.
yeah.
And you just kind of made me think about it, but watch it. Ibelin, Ibelin.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, I don't even know if you have Netflix in Australia, but check it out.
We can get it. I just don't have it at the time.
Okay, maybe we could find that another way.
Yeah,
All right, so keep going. You're learning all these things. You're learning both shifts in perspective and also a process, some tools that are allowing you to change your self-loathing, self-condemnation, judgment of yourself into really what it sounds like finding a way to be kind to yourself and accept yourself.
yeah. I think that's sort of the turning point in my life was working through that because when you're starting from a position of judging yourself, you're going to then project that onto other people. You're going to judge other people to the same standard, essentially, that you judge yourself.
Yeah.
But then the other side of that is that the things that you hate about yourself, you're going to highlight in other people's lives because, for one, it covers that pain of not loving it in yourself. Two, it draws attention away from you and puts it onto the other person. But moving into a space of unconditional high regard and focusing on loving myself unconditionally or have an unconditional high regard for myself, not because I've earned it. And I think the unconditional is important.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just simply high regard, it's unconditional high
Mm-hmm.
regard. It's high regard because it's intrinsic in me to be worthy.
Mm-hmm.
It is part of our nature to have worth. It's something that you earn. It's not something that you have to gain. It's something that you have. And the unconditional high regard is you're giving it to yourself because that's what you want to do. No
Yep.
reason other than other.
Yeah, it's the only way to escape the inertia of that whole system of performance is you have to find a way to stop playing the game, because as soon as you take unconditional out of it, it's back to conditional. And if if regard is conditional, well, then worth is conditional, and really everything, the foundation of life, is gone,
Yeah,
because now life has to be getting back to a sense of being worthy of everything you want. If you think about, hey, I want connection, I want intimacy, I want love, appreciation, kindness, respect, warmth, compassion, empathy. If you start listing off all these things you want in life, if they are rooted in conditional regard, well, then you have a lot of work to do, and you can't have the life you want until you earn it,
yeah.
right? And
Oh,
so I
definitely.
just want to I want to just reiterate your point, because it's a really essential point. It has to be unconditional for your security of person to be unconditional,
Yeah,
because your ultimately your confidence, I think it's fair to say, at least one level of confidence, must be in your value, worth, and significance as a human. And if that value, worth, and significance as a human is conditional, your security will be conditional. And if your security is conditional, then you're not ultimately a person you can trust, right? Like when you're
Yeah.
insecure, you're going to do all the things that are insecure, that are rooted in insecurity. So this is why unconditional high regard is so powerful. Is it breaks all of that. It breaks the whole system, and it gives you a mechanism to live in an entirely different way, where you're worthy for the love, life, everything that you want now. And actually everybody is. And because if you're worthy of intrinsic value, well, then the people around you are too, right? And
That's
now
right.
you no longer have the basis for judgment. So yeah, keep unpacking that a little bit, because I know this is an important topic to you.
Yeah. It's for me. It was the turning point in my life. So understanding that and coming to really live it. I think there's a difference between understanding it in your head but living it in your heart. And the practice of actually doing it, particularly like starting with yourself, loving yourself, accepting yourself, and what it ends up doing is it changes your relationships with everyone else too. Because now it's so much easier for me to be able to meet someone else and have empathy for them because I'm not feeling judged by them. I'm not feeling condemned by them because I love and accept myself. And I know that I'm loved and accepted by God despite the things that I'm struggling with or going through. And it gives me then the freedom to do that to my children, gives me the freedom to do that to my wife, and also to everyone outside of my family, to be able to that's sort of the foundation, in a sense, for all of your relationships. You cannot love someone else more than you love yourself. The love and regard that you have for yourself, that is the ceiling that you have for everyone else. And if you want to be able to show love and regard or high regard for anyone else, you need to start with yourself first. You need to improve your own view of yourself to be able to move forward and to be able to improve that. Focusing on unconditional high regard for myself and the way that it works in my head was a term that I'm sure I heard come from you. There's a difference between an internal locus of control and an external locus of control. The reason why I bring this up is because the moment you seek something externally in order to receive something, you have an external locus of control. You're no longer in unconditional high regard.
Right? Because
You're,
it's
you
conditional, right? The external is
that's right.
conditional.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
And it's so subtle. And it's such a subtle, small shift that the term external locus of control, internal locus of control is rooted and founded. The foundation of that is unconditional high regard. So the moment you, and for myself, it's a kind of an experience, a feeling. There's something off in my body because my body knows it doesn't like it. When I'm trying to, uh, it could be manipulate the a response out of someone. So if I want someone to respond to something particular in a particular way, and I'm then thinking about how am I going to approach this in order to influence their
Yeah.
decision,
Yeah.
all of a sudden I've now gone to an external locus of control. I've gone to a conditional regard for that person. So what part of my thinking do I need to look at in order to pull back my thinking back to an internal locus of control? Why why do I feel like I need something from this person in order to feel good about myself? Why do I not feel good about myself? Simply because of myself.
I would add that I believe that our emotions and feelings are our body's indicator to help us with this, to show us if my focus is externally, which is the same thing as conditional, or internally, which is the same thing as unconditional. When this is just a pattern, and I would encourage anybody listening to test it and test us in this. When you look outside of yourself and conditionally, you will have a negative or an unfavorable emotional state eventually. And so if you start to use your emotions as the indicator helping you to see when you're focused on conditional external things, you'll get really good at this. And that's exactly what we teach men to do. And Masterful is to cultivate an awareness of your emotions so that you start to, instead of trying to avoid them and suppress them and stuff them, you learn to use them, like you would the engine light on a car. Oh, I'm feeling some hard things. And then stop and slow down. And what you'll find is you're looking outside of yourself to conditions that to try to develop basically a conditional well-being, a conditional acceptance. And that's a matter of the story that you're kind of living in, the perception, and you can switch that. You have choice and agency. Anyway, that's more for our listener than for you. I know you know this,
Yeah,
but it's a
I like
tremendously helpful tool.
definitely, and I look at it from perhaps a different analogy may help other people in the
Do it.
sense that imagine if you're sleeping and the smoke alarm goes off and you get annoyed by the smoke alarm going off, and so what you do is you grab your pillow and you stuff your pillow around your head to cover your ears because you want to go back to sleep. And when that doesn't work, you eventually get out of bed, go to your smoke alarm, remove the battery from the smoke alarm, and go, "Phew, that's better now. I can go back to sleep." Um, and jump back into bed and go proceed to try and go back to sleep again. Um, I use the analogy the smoke alarm is your feelings or the experience of your feelings that you're going through. To say there is something wrong um, in your thinking.
Or at least it believes it's there. There may not be true smoke, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's there to get your attention.
That's right. Yeah. And one I do like recently experienced would be frustration because frustration is rooted in anger. And anger is one of those things that something is wrong. So that's the warning light or the smoke alarm going off, going, there's something wrong. Now, it could be wrong in my thinking, it could be wrong in my experience, or someone is treating me wrong, or something like that. But generally speaking, when I'm getting frustrated with people in my family, like my children and my wife, it is because there's something wrong with me. They are highlighting in my life something that I'm not operating from an internal locus of control. So they're highlighting something that I believe has to be externally from me. So, for example, if I want to have a relaxing evening and watch a movie with my wife, but the children have to be in bed at a specific time for that to happen, well, let's say my child is experiencing some hard emotions that he's going through and that comes out in misbehavior. If I'm getting frustrated with my child in that moment because I feel like I deserve to have my evening, then the problem is that I am focusing on an external result in order to get an internal feeling,
Mm-hmm.
rather than accepting and looking at it from the perspective of acceptance and treating my child with acceptance. I'm treating my child with an expectation. I'm pushing onto him
Right.
him or her an expectation of you must behave in a certain way so that I can feel good about myself. And so
Yeah,
that's where,
there's this thing, just to kind of say this another way for our listener. Our brains are always perceiving and interpreting not just the present, but they're predicting the future. And when your brain perceives or predicts a future in which you don't have a choice because it's externally controlled and your desires and well-being are now outside of you, you're going to feel bad. That's what's going on, right? So our perceptions are ultimately the issue, meaning it's not so much that something is really going on, it's that the way you're perceiving and interpreting what is going on in your context is going to either be interpreted through a lens where there's an internal locus of control for your desires or an external locus. And if it's an external
yeah,
locus, you are going to have emotional friction.
yeah,
And emotional friction will produce what I would call emotional heat, anger, frustration. It will not feel good. And so if you work backwards, you haven't said this yet, but I want to highlight it for our listener. You don't need to change the circumstances. You need to change the perception and your
yeah,
interpretation. I just had lunch with one of our members today, and we were talking about this, and I used the example like we were in a restaurant. We went there on purpose, and we knew we'd be there for about an hour. And I said to him, now imagine, even though you and I came here for an hour to eat on purpose, to spend time together, imagine if they told us, hey, we're locking you in. By the way the brain works, your perception, your interpretation, even though we came there to be there for an hour, the moment somebody told us we had to stay there for an hour, and we perceived that we had no control, we would have had an emotional reaction. And the reason for that is that's exactly how it works. And that's just a shift in perception. We were already going to be there for an hour. We went there by our voluntary choice, and it felt good. But this is kind of an oversimplification, but that is the pattern. When you believe in your perception that you no longer have a choice for
Yeah.
your will and desires, your emotions, just like that, they'll start to come online, and they alert you that this is going on.
Yeah, and I think that you can really pick that up in your own thinking when if you're talking to yourself or thinking to yourself that I must do this, I have to do that, I should do
Mm-hmm.
this,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of a language that it gives you a sort of a warning sign to go, okay, what where am I at in my thinking that I believe that something externally from me, I do not have control over this.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Powerlessness is how I would say that.
yeah, and so that sort of is one of those things that helps you see and turn back and look at yourself. Yeah, because I live by the mentality that the only person you can control is yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're going through these things, use it as a tool to look back at yourself. So yeah, in that sense, I do think that it really highlights the necessity of unconditional high regard because it really highlights the fact that you need to have a good and a comfortable understanding of yourself, a love for yourself, a high regard for yourself before you can go anywhere else. Because without that, you, yeah, it's not going to be any different than what you're experiencing, your discomfort or anything like that. Yeah,
Could you tell us a little bit then, because we've gotten pretty deep into the some of the philosophy and concepts behind the stuff we do in Masterful and whatnot. Could you share with our listener how these ways of changing your perspective and understanding, how do they start to make a tangible difference in your life, like day to day, in your relationships with your wife, with your children, with your job, etc.?
yeah. I think it's the foundation for me living my life from a perspective of this is how I want to show up. And that's in stark contrast to what I mentioned earlier on in our conversation being I would show up to different people in different ways. And so because I want to be known as a person who shows up in a particular way, then I will show up in my marriage in a particular way. I would show up in my work life in a particular way. I would then show up my social life in a particular way because that's how I wanted to show up and being the that would be the primary essentially
Do you
difference.
think
And I think
is that from just figuring out in this process who you are because you gave yourself an opportunity to really discover who that was without any condemnation?
definitely, yeah. And I think like early on through this process, before I had really sort of grounded myself in an unconditional high regard, if when someone asked me like, "What do you want? What do you want in your life?" Like, I would not have been able to answer that. I was not able to answer that because I didn't know. Because I was living in a perspective of I needed other people to tell me what I wanted in order for me to feel like this is what I want.
Yeah.
Because I had such a focus on what other people thought of me that I needed them to tell me that
Yeah.
in order to feel good about myself.
Shapeshifters, when we're in shape shifting mode, you really don't know what you want because you're actually not used to finding out what you want. You're trying to find out what other people want so you can meet that need, so you can stay feeling okay. So it's actually a great way to know if you're living this way is if you have a hard time answering what you want, even as simple as where would you like to eat dinner? What flavor ice cream do you want? Um, it can be an indication that you're disconnected from yourself. because of this.
Yeah.
Pretty common thing in every man I've ever met, anyway, at some point in his life. From your understanding, unpack how that started to turn things around in your marriage, like just being
Um,
able to be this way.
I think probably the biggest one would be the, the being able to come to terms with sexual rejection in the marriage because it now no longer plays into or against my sense of worthiness. It's an acceptance. Okay, yeah, that's fine. In that sense, where you then have the freedom and the power to show up each and every day because that's what you want to do. And from that perspective, it's no longer a showing up because how does my wife want me to show up? It's a showing up because I want to show up this way. And in that sense, I think it's really sort of focusing on more on the freedom aspect of it because now I'm not thinking, how do I have to show up at work? How do I have to show up at home? How do I have to show up for all these other things? It's
Mm.
more, I know how I want to show up. I know how I'm going to show up. So yeah, that gives me then more freedom in my thinking in my headspace in a sense to be
I
able
gotcha.
to, yeah.
Have your relationships improved? Like, would you?
I definitely think so. I definitely think my relationship with my wife has improved and the relationship with my children has improved. I think in that sense, it's, yeah, there's definitely something that is much better in the grand scheme of things because, yeah, especially in my marriage relationship where, I think showing up in this way makes it a lot easier for my wife to show up in this way.
Do you feel like she feels more seen and heard and understood by
I
you
definitely,
than she did in the past?
I definitely think so. I definitely think that's a huge contributing factor to it all too. When the difference between showing up in this way now and showing up how I was it's a lot more predictable for her in that sense.
So it feels safe and trustable, predictable that way.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
provides a much safer and nicer environment for yeah just the home life in that sense too.
How about being mopey and low and pissy? Where are you at with those things now?
So I don't show up in my marriage in those that way anymore. And a huge thing for this would be community for me. I wouldn't be where I am today without community,
Why?
because this is a constant lifelong thing. I see it as a lifelong thing. It's not something that you do once and fix. Okay, yeah, sweet, I've done that. We'll put that aside and we'll move on to the next thing. It's a daily practice. Sometimes with depending on where I'm at in my thinking, how tired I am, or whatever the case may be,
Yeah.
I'm then struggling with something and I need support and I need help for something. It's not my wife's place to provide me with that help and support. It's men need to speak to other men. And so by taking it to the men, and particularly if it's a frustration that I have with what my wife is doing or going through, then taking it to the community and to the men also, it gives me the opportunity to then essentially say it and have other people to speak into my life and to encourage me to really highlight the areas of my thinking that are not an unconditional high regard. And they can say, okay, well, here in this area of your life, you're being conditional. And it's going, oh, okay, that's great because now I've got a new perspective, and I then have the tools and the power to actually change that.
Okay, so this is going to get to that question now. I wanted you to remind me of, and it's a little bit vulnerable for me to ask because I don't know how you're going to answer it. Not that I know how
Okay.
you're going to answer any of this stuff. Why does a guy living in Australia, the top part of North Australia, like, why are you in a community of men that we have other Australians, so it's not just you. But why would you choose a community with so many Americans, and largely in North America? Like, what is it about that for you that you chose Masterful Men?
So for me, the reason why I chose it is because of the values of the community, because of the vulnerability, the fact that I see and I recognize that we need community. Men need community. They need brotherhood. They need to be able to focus on these things. And this is something that I am familiar with. It's one that I found through my process of searching. I'm sure there may be others around. I just haven't found them. And I feel like that I'm still at a certain part of my journey where this is the best thing for me right now, to be a
Yeah.
part of this community and to be able to not only just be a part of it to consume, but to be a part of it to contribute as well. And I found too that often contributing in the community has helped me more than bringing my problems into the community, because it
Yeah.
really helps me then bring to the forefront of my mind the thinking and the processes that I went through 2 or 3 years ago in order to be able to get to the point where I'm at today. And
Hmm.
that's immensely helpful too.
Yeah, it's like when you're serving other people, there's a implicit gift in the service of one another that you get more of what you need, right? I started a community for this exact reason. I was just getting so much out of sharing. So, I mean,
Yeah.
it was a self-ish thing. It wasn't self-serving, but I needed it. I still need it. There's just such a blessing and benefit that comes to me from being in a place where maybe I offer something to you because I'll dredge something up maybe out of myself to help you that I needed to hear, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's pretty useful. What would you tell if you could go back and tell like your younger self 5 years ago, 6 years ago, whatever? If you had to tell him one thing, what would you tell him?
Yeah. I've been really thinking about this too. And I would focus on telling him to look into unconditional high regard,
Hmm.
to really focus on understanding what unconditional high regard is. In the sense that, yeah, like 6 years ago, I think, and where I was at, that is probably the only thing that would have piqued my interest enough for me to actually look into it more, because that is the changing point for my life, really, the
Yeah.
catalyst I needed to change. So if I was to go back and talk to him about it, that's what it would be.
Same for me, actually. And interestingly, I was starting to investigate that topic years before my own turnaround and what I was missing. And I'm just throwing this out there because you mentioned community. I was missing community. Even though I had been looking into it for years, it was like something clicked that only clicked for me once I was in part of a community.
Yeah.
And I had put like years and years into trying to work things out for myself. Because community is like walking into a hall of mirrors and you can suddenly see things clearly that you couldn't see before. So yeah, just sharing that for the man listening who thinks he's familiar with these topics. You might be. Most men are just missing connection with other men where they can process this stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's when the real growth happens too, because it's a process that you have to go through. It's something that you grow into. So being with other men who accept you for who you are and for
Yeah.
where you're at and encourage you, and they don't come from a perspective of judgment. Um, that they're not talking down at you. They're
Yeah.
encouraging.
Yeah.
They're appreciative of your struggles.
Which
That's
which is people that are holding you in unconditional high regard. I think this is why it's so
yeah,
powerful is you're trying to understand this thing, but your experience of yourself is that you've always held yourself in conditional regard. So in order to have like a new experience of this UHR thing, you need to go somewhere where people will show you, like, hey, here's what it feels like to be treated with unconditional high regard, which means we're not going to shame you. We're not going to judge you. We're not going to belittle you. We're not going to speak down at you because we unconditionally believe you're worthy of high regard. I think that's kind of the mechanics of how it works, the community aspect.
definitely. And I think that's why it's so important, is because you get an unconditional high regard reflected back to you. And as humans, we learn by seeing more so than being
Yeah.
told.
Those
Um,
motor neurons. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
mhm.
Okay. So, for this last bit, I'm trying to follow a little bit different interview format this time. What should I have asked you about that I didn't, or that you wish I had?
Yeah. I think we've covered everything because we've really gone through the whole process, I think. And
Yeah.
perhaps the one thing that we haven't gone through would be the if you are stuck, well, I've been stuck in a mentality of a vice being either alcohol or substance abuse or something along those lines. Uh, how deeply rooted for myself some of those things were in my own understanding of self-loathing. Um, and for myself, it was overeating. The the ability to not necessarily the ability, but the significance that that has with your thinking in my life, at least. I look back at that and go, that's a warning sign for insecurity and ultimately leading to self-loathing. Is the real focus on that aspect of it? Is there are so many aspects of your life that all point back to the same thing. That if you're
Mm,
struggling in your marriage, if you're struggling in your life, and if you're struggling in these things, it comes back to what areas, those areas of your life, you have self-loathing.
yeah. Yeah. Some core beliefs, we would say, right? So
Yeah.
in the renewed masculine man, you might remember we have this idea of the pyramid. You
Mm.
know, the that every result you have in life comes from a habit, and every habit is an action that you've practiced so much it's become a habit. All your actions are born from beliefs and thoughts, right? That ultimately are about the stories that you carry around. So if you have results you don't want, there are absolutely beliefs you have at the root. And so
Yeah.
you don't fix results by trying to change results. You fix results by changing the core beliefs. And when you
Hmm.
do that, it'll radically change your whole life. And it sounds like what I love about your story is it just sounds like you had this radically poor belief about your value and worth, the self loathing that you had, and that radically changing that to self acceptance and unconditional high regard, it sounds like Chris really made a big impact for you. That's
Yeah,
no
it definitely
surprise.
has.
No
Yeah.
surprise at all. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for being a guest. I really appreciate it. And I think this is going to resonate with a lot of people out there who struggle like you have and like I have too with this idea of self-loathing, not feeling valuable and worthy. So I
Mm.
appreciate your vulnerability and for your participation and letting yourself be seen today. It takes a lot of courage to do that.
Thank you.
All right, good to be with you. I'll see you soon. Thanks for tuning in to the Masterful Man podcast. If today's conversation resonated with you and you're ready to break free from stuckness, build unshakable confidence, and lead your life with unstoppable purpose, I invite you to take the next step. Join a community of men who are committed to growth, challenge, and real transformation. Learn more at www.masterful.men because the life you want starts with the man you choose to become.